Good afternoon. Welcome to the Center for Iranian Diaspora Studies on this wonderful March 11th, 2021. It is an honor today to welcome Priscilla Kounkou-Hoveyda and Alex Eskandarkhah. Today we'll bring you a wonderful presentation by the Collective for Black Iranians, and it's an organization that was founded in 2020 out of necessity and to make visible the stories and the voices of Black Iranians throughout the world. And we're especially delighted to have these two founding members of the collective with us because early in the Black Lives Matter protests, we felt the need to engage, and we didn't know that the collective existed. So we've learned a lot by watching their work and seeing their collaborations with lots of artists and other organizations. So we're delighted to have you both today. I'm going to briefly introduce the two speakers, and then I'm going to let them conduct this presentation, and we'll have time for Q&A at the end. We invite you, when the Q&A box is open, to add your questions, and if you can, try to make them somewhat succinct, and we'll try to answer as many as we can in the time we have. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Priscilla and Alex, and I'm going to start by introducing Priscilla Kounkou-Hoveyda. She's a Congolese, Iranian, French human rights lawyer, writer, documentary filmmaker, and one of the founding members of the Collective for Black Iranians, which is a chapter-based nonprofit with a mission of amplifying Black and Afro-Iranian voices within the Iranian diaspora, as well as to educate on the connections between Africanness and Blackness and Iranian identity. It's also driven by a mission to advocate for the representation of Black and Afro-Iranians in Iranian narratives. Priscilla is a graduate of the Sorbonne Law, NYU Law and ESSEC Business School, and a dropout of USC Film School. In her endeavors of navigating the many intersections of her identity, Priscilla realized early on the need to bring people together to discuss their shared humanity while also celebrating their differences. Her human rights work, which is her day job, includes building international and national policies for the most vulnerable populations around the world. She's led the release and reintegration of children associated with armed groups and forces, commonly known as child soldiers, incarcerated children, and survivors of sexual violence. She has over a decade of experience working with the United Nations Children's Fund and other UN agencies on non-governmental organizations in the US, France, the Democratic Republic of Congo, the Islamic Republic of Mauritania, the Central African Republic, and the Federal Republic of Nigeria. In parallel with her human rights work, Priscilla has created short films for the UN and other nonprofit organizations to further awareness of underrepresented voices and communities around the world. Along with Priscilla, the collective was founded by 5 others, and I'll name them here: Alex Eskandarkhah, Pardis Nkoy, Norman Sultan Salashur, and Humayun Fiamour. This collective is the first of its kind to creatively disrupt existing mainstream narratives around what it means to be or look Iranian, bringing for the first time conversations around Blackness, race, and more generally, why it's important to forge deeper connections through stories and knowledge. Alex, who's with us as well, is born in Toronto, Canada, and he currently resides in Edmonton. He's a producer, writer, entrepreneur, and radio podcast personality. He's the creator and host and producer of The Gifted Gab, a talk show series that focuses on current events and observational commentary and satire. Alex is of Afro-Iranian descent, born to an Iranian father and an Afro-Iranian mother. He's a graduate of York University with a major in sociology. So you can see we have quite a, just in these two people, lots of migrations and travels and geographies and histories. And so I'm so delighted to hear from you both today and to share the work of the collective, which is most impressive, what you've accomplished in such a short amount of time. And we're looking forward to seeing some of the samples of those collaborations and projects. So welcome and thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much for having us, Persis. It's a pleasure. And I think with no further ado, we'd love to jump in the presentation and start that conversation with everyone. Thank you for joining. Salam alaikum from wherever you are connecting. It's lovely to have you here. Please bear with us as we're about to dive into what we believe to be an absolutely fascinating conversation that should have happened many, many moons ago. But here we are with all of you. And welcome to our conversation on centering Blackness in the Iranian diaspora. As Persis so kindly and generously introduced, my name is Priscilla, and I am indeed from Congo and Iran, born in France, grew up in the two countries that my parents and I are from, as well as the country where I was born later on, and now based in the US for the past 2 to 3 years before our next discovery. So welcome. This conversation about centering Blackness in the Iranian diaspora came to us at the collective because obviously we had, not just last summer, but throughout our lives, been witnesses to the erasure of our stories, and how when it came to Black narratives within the Iranian diaspora, there were none that were being given the forefront. There were none that were being invited in conversations about who we are. And that's how actually, you know, the idea of the collective started, in recognizing that the Iranian diaspora has indeed many voices, and that at its heart, there are also Black and African voices, and that it is no longer possible to historically continue to erase Black and African voices that are a part of the Iranian diaspora. Just like we should no longer contemporaneously ignore Black and African voices that are from and a part of the Iranian diaspora and the Iranian community. And I would even say that it's a social responsibility to listen to voices that we may not have known existed, and to listen very, very closely with an open heart to perhaps discover stories and even history that we may not, for whatever reason, have heard of. And then dive into this fascinating, I believe, exploration of self and of identity. But the collective truly believes that the first step in exploring who we are is also acknowledging all the different segments of who we are. And so the Collective for Black Iranians was actually founded out of necessity. From my personal perspective, it was definitely the necessity to be seen, to be heard, to be understood, but from my own point of view, not from the opinion or the judgment of what my existence should sound like, or what my identity should be diminished to or amplified to, but simply the need to be listened to with an open heart. And also the excitement of discovering what kind these sorts of conversation bring our diaspora and our community, and how can it actually bring us together in better understanding all the different segments that makes who we are, without ignoring also the voices that perhaps were not put at the forefront at all before. And so when we started and founded the collective with Alex, and as well as Patty Saw and Pagdis and Alex and Norman, but many others across the diaspora as well as in Iran, truly the goal was to center storytelling as well as arts and creative activism, to ensure that we're creatively disrupting the discourses that were taking place. And bear in mind, when it comes to the Iranian American diaspora, that we had a really, really rough summer when it comes to Black Iranians, because we've had to sit down through conversations talking about violence against Black folks, when our community had never talked about conversation about existence within the Iranian diaspora, and listened to who we are and what we have to say. But when the events resumed with Black Lives Matter, conversations started with very little to no presence, definitely no presence of a collective voice that could come forward and share experiences. So we decided to bring storytellers, thinkers, creative activists, and artists. And instead of staying at the margins and continuing to just be witnesses of conversations that were being had about us, without us, we decided to take center stage and lead conversation about Blackness, and hopefully have the Iranian diaspora recognize all the beautiful different segments of who we are, instead of finding ways to reduce who we are and say, well, you're only half, you're only a quarter, you're only 20%, so let me be the center of the conversation. There is no such scientific repetition of identity. Identity is whole. You can have two parents from two different places. It doesn't cut your identity in half. It actually amplifies it. If you're for 7 countries, it's amplified by culture, by language, by travels. So we wanted to bring these beautiful stories to the forefront of the diaspora and the global diaspora.
Yeah, and just to piggyback on what Priscilla was saying, the collective brings for the first time, the voices of these Black and Afro-Iranians from the diaspora and also from inside Iran, as well as Canada, the United States, France, and Germany. And we want to ensure that these conversations around Blackness within the Iranian diaspora are held at the center of the perspective of Black and Afro-Iranians. I'm very big on representation, and far too often the conversation was being had without any thought of any Black or Afro-Iranians, or even told from the perspective of Black and Afro-Iranians. And I'd like to clarify, I know this question will come up, why we use the words Black and Afro-Iranian, and the point is to leave that space for people to identify with either Black or Afro-Iranian. Some people prefer the term Afro-Iranian, some people prefer the term Black, and in the Iranian context, the term Siyah, which means Black, is looked at in a negative connotation. So for us as Black and Afro-Iranians, or just Black people, period, we want to rewrite those definitions and make sure that there's a healthy connotation with the word Black, because as you will find out, Black is beautiful.
So I feel like so much has already been said, but we're just at the beginning of the presentation, so please bear with us. But indeed, Black is beautiful, and there is absolutely nothing wrong with saying it. It's also something that we want to bring to the community. Very interestingly enough, the resistance with total transparency usually comes with different generations who have not been aware of this kind of language, and that this kind of language was okay to have. So we also want to have an intergenerational dialogue, because we can't live in societies from the past. We actually are about to live in societies that are forward in the future, not the other way around.
So here at the collective, we have 3 pillars: educate, amplify, and advocate. So the first one that we'll dive into is educating on the connections between Africa, Iran, Blackness, as well as advocating for greater representation of Blackness in Iranian narratives. Truly, our mission is just to create that space that combats anti-Blackness discourse and sentiment, and celebrate the diversity of the Iranian diaspora.
Absolutely. And as you'll come to find out, and I think as we came to find out also, as we kept growing and finding other people who could relate to the stories and to the mission of the collective, actually the collective is a place for anyone and everyone who have felt at some point or at several points in their life that perhaps they were not Iranian enough for whatever reason that people were giving them, or that they needed to do X, Y, Z to be able to be considered Iranian. Maybe they needed to speak fluent Farsi or undergo a couple nose surgeries or whatever else we know that we have going on in our wonderful community. And the collective is here to say that you're Iranian despite of what you look like, thanks to what you look like, regardless of, how well you speak Farsi or don't, and so forth. So it became a place truly for people to find ways to connect with the very different segments and layers of who we are. And with the public education prong, which is central in the work that we do. By centering history, we find a lot of inspiration in African literature, African Black thought leadership, that we want to bring to the Iranian community that unfortunately far too often has a rather narrow understanding of what Africa and Black African thought leadership, literature, wisdom is about. So, in the words of Chinua Achebe, Nigerian novelist, change maker, a grand thinker, until the lions have their own historians, the history of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. So very logically for us at the collective, we wanted to center history in ways that pay attention to the humanity of the stories that are being researched, that look into all the different segments and corners of that humanity as research is being made. And also in the words of Chinua Achebe, as we can see it here in this beautiful illustration also done by the first one by a Black American artist, China Duma, and the second one by an Iranian American artist, Kimia Fatehi. We also want to tell everyone who wants to tell their story that it is possible to take a step forward and tell your own story to the sound of your own drums, to the sound of your truth, of your point of view, and to take that space. And that's what the collective is doing, is taking that space through history, and as Alex was saying, through the amplification and the advocacy prong as well. And through the public education prong, when we dive into the history, we do so in collaboration with scholars and historians, with our resident historian, Bitaba Houlizadeh, who has been supporting us since the launch of the collective, and in collaboration with all the different creatives of the collective, to make sure also that these parts of history are told in ways where they can actually benefit who they're being researched about, rather than doing scholarly work for merit basis or for tenure or for, success. We also find social responsibility in telling stories that are marginalized and erased and ignored. And we appreciate making it in a way that's accessible so that Afro-Iranians or Black Iranians who are African descent in Iran from the diaspora can have a better understanding of our identities. And so we started with the history, and we like to call it histories because we like to emphasize that with history there is a story. We started with the story of Khyzran as well as the story of the pearl divers, always making sure that these stories of Black and Afro-Iranians from around the world are understood not just through a lens of forced migration, but also through a lens of chosen migration. Because throughout the world's history, people have been moving, whether it's voluntarily or forced, unfortunately, including Black African people have also been moving. And so with the history of Khyzran, with the collective, and thanks to the work also of other scholars, such as Anthony Lee, who's also a scholar at, I believe, UCLA, we find out that Khyzran was a daughter, a sister, a mentor who was born in 1856, and who actually fought for her freedom in our dear country, Iran, because she was kidnapped from Zanzibar one night when she was walking from home from a dance, according to research, not according to legend. Again, according to factual records, historical records, she was kidnapped and brought to forcefully to Iran, and became a slave, where she met Wallade, a 13-year-old boy who was also enslaved in another family, and the story goes on. We're not going to retell the histories of Khyzran, even though I could tell the story over and over again, because I believe it's such an important story to be told. But what truly we want to emphasize by unearthing these stories is to show these connections between Iran and Africa. These stories are from the late 1800s. Even if they were from the 12th century, my belief is that we should know the different parts of who we are and makes up who we are. But this story happens, you know, in a century that's not so far away from us, and is a reminder of the fact that the Persian Gulf slave trade, despite several attempts of it being abolished prior, was only abolished in 1929 in Iran. And while I am not personally a scholar or a historian, I find power in knowing that part of history between Iran and Africa, even though it's a story of forced migration. What's important to see in this particular image, and I hope that internet is allowing the audience to follow this story as we're showing it, but it's a beautiful art piece by one of our resident artists, Mina Jafari, an Iranian-American artist. And you can see Khyzran Wallade here, where she goes back to a certain Mullah Muhammad, who was an Iranian employee of the British agent, and where she fights for her freedom. So this is not only a story of a woman who was enslaved, or unfortunately, as we have often very painfully read in a lot of scholarly articles, this is not a story of a concubine or a domestic servant. This is a story of an enslaved African Black woman who was forced into a marriage. You're not a concubine if you're forced into a marriage. You're an enslaved woman who is unfortunately a survivor of sexual violence. And I think as scholars, as historians, also as lawyers, as doctors, whatever is our line of work, it comes with a certain duty of telling these stories with the right language to give the dignity to these stories, and also enable people to connect with these stories and what it means to them potentially. We also look into the places we're from, also in collaboration with our resident historian, where we look into place names as another way to see the connections between Africa and Iran. We look into names of countries or islands, and such as Zanzibar here that you can see, which is a beautiful island off of the coast of Tanzania. Hey, the audience, if you want to travel to Africa, don't miss Zanzibar once COVID permits. But it shows that these terms were terms in languages that our ancestors spoke on both sides when it comes to, as far as my identity is concerned, and same as far as Alex's identity is concerned, and for you, Persis, on one side, you know, so it's, why not look into these parts of history if it can help us better understand who we are? Ignoring it certainly does not help with understanding who we are. So we look into Mogadishu and other places. We look into also stories that connect the region, not necessarily just the continent or certain parts of the continent and Iran. And we hope, in the hopes that our community will come to the factual realization that when they say things such as, وای اصلا نمیدونستم که ایرانی‌ها میتونستن سیاه باشن. I didn't know that Iranians could be Black. I didn't know that we had Black people in Iran. Oh Lord, how can you speak Farsi? This is insane. These types of statements are not only deeply ignorant, but they're also harmful. They're also harmful because it's denying the knowledge of the existence of an individual in that sense. So it's also what the collective comes to do. And we'll talk about it a little later in the presentation.
Yeah, as our, as we said before, representation is very, very important. And that brings us to our Writing Ourselves series. And if we're not at the forefront of these stories, then the story is being told for us. Here we have an example with the help of our resident historian. We're able to identify a painting of a portrait within Golestan Palace. And if you see in the original on the right, there is a eunuch. So what the collective has done is write ourselves with some dignity and represent Blackness as a positive. And what you see here on the left is that recreation of that same eunuch. And this is why the history part of it is very powerful. How we're represented, if at all, right, is usually in a negative connotation. So the collective is here to take back that representation and rewrite ourselves into history from our perspective, from our stories that are told to us and that we research ourselves.
And we also have been, I mean, again, the collective has only been in existence since August 20th, 2020. In my head, it's been in existence all my life. In Alex's head, all his life, but he's younger. So, and, you know, etc. Because you'll notice for a lot of Black Iranians, Black folks in the community, is that oftentimes a lot of us will say, I thought I was the only one. I didn't know there were other ones. And, you know, it's a feeling that could be interpreted as feeling really special and unique, but it's also a feeling that is very isolating and quite stigmatizing in an environment where you may not have other Black folks. I grew up partly in Iran, and I spend still a significant amount of time when I can, when it's not COVID and a pandemic, in Iran. And when I'm in Tehran or Isfahan or in the whole parts of Iran, quite frankly, that I got to go, I stand out. I stand out not because I'm wearing a hijab. I stand out not because I'm dressed differently. I stand out because I'm Black. And people let me know. And people have let me know for since I'm a child. And what's really, really, truly fascinating to me is the ignorance around that reality, which is a testament of how we don't have a dialogue in the community, and which actually students shouldn't surprise anyone, because anybody who comes from this wonderful community know that the most important topics often we love to push it under our beautiful fasces. So, you know, we like to read and converse and have dialogues, and we believe that if the conversation is not making you uncomfortable, you're not having a conversation. It's just a performative chit chat. And even though a lot of people don't want to hear it, we do so in the hopes that the children of our children, future children, hopefully will get to a stage where they'll be past that and they'll actually be envisioning the next steps. And so with our partnerships, such as the one that we were so honored to launch with Because We've Read, which is an international radical book club, we dive into, you know, what is transnational Blackness. Quite frankly, for me, and I think it's safe to say for Alex too, we know exactly what transnational Blackness is. You know, we're Black folks who come from parts of the world, whether it is because of migration that were forced or chosen, or folks falling in love, whatever it is. We come from communities that we know have Black folks, while everybody thought that they wouldn't. And then we grew up and we read and we traveled further, for some of us, to many, many different places, and was the confirmation through our experiences, because of course, experiences are also expertise, develop also and turn also into an expertise. That transnational Blackness concept, looking into the presence of Blackness, of Black folks throughout, you know, Swana communities or Mina communities, and what do we have to say? Someone who is, let's say, you know, Lebanese and maybe Kenyan, who lives in Beirut, or someone who is Iranian of African descent living in Zanzibar, or someone who is African of Iranian descent, someone who is part African, someone who is part Iranian. I mean, there are so many nuances and rays. The fact that the Iranian diaspora have only looked into one you know, way is extremely shocking. So with the Because We've Read and the Collective of Black Iranian, as well as actually Khyzran Republic, which is a publishing house, for those who may not be familiar with it, that was founded in Nigeria and is one of the only publishing houses in the world that focuses on publishing African voices and Black African voices from across the diaspora. They are publishing a wonderful novel by Victoria Prince Will, called, actually Alex, because he finished it. So I'm still halfway, but you know, In the Palace of Flowers.
Yeah, it's the story of an enslaved Black girl living in Golistan Palace during the Qajar dynasty. And it's a very important story. It's somewhat of a tragedy, and it's the story of being forgotten, which is very parallel to everything that the collective represents. You know, a lot of our stories have been erased and forgotten. So it's very interesting that you know, an African writer could come out and write about this, and it's important that it's done from, once again, a Black perspective. We've paired that book alongside our resident historian's work, Bita Bakulizadeh, an excerpt from Seeing Race, and her research gives the novel a lot of context. And it's a very, very important read when you take into consideration that the Qajar dynasty was not that long ago, right? And you know, it's a couple of generations, you know. So it gives a lot of context to how Black people have ended up in Iran, because we do know that Blackness is transnational. It's not relegated to just one region. It's not relegated to one continent. So there are Black people in Iran, and the research and the novel and all of the other content that we do push out in our partnerships help to, you know, reinforce that, you know, seeking that knowledge and seeking that information and putting the pieces of the puzzle together to understand how indeed Black people did end up in Iran and the connections between Africa and Iran.
Mm-hmm. And it's yeah, so we hope you join our book club because we've read. Please read with us. We get a lot of questions in the DMs, and quite frankly, these questions, if you guys read, you would already know the answers. So please join us so that instead of answering questions such as, I didn't know there were Black people in Iran, we can actually think about how can we move forward. And now that we know that, what are the other conversations that can stem from it? What can we grow? What can we do to grow more out of it? So in all our partnerships is what we want to bear in mind is what can potentially help the community to grow with a better understanding of the different segments of who we are, including the Black and African segments. And then comes the amplifying prong, which we also call voices from home, voices of Black Iranians. And we come to challenge also the understanding of home. It's very interesting for our community because evidently all of us or some of us come from immigrant families who have left Iran perhaps in the 70s, perhaps in the late 70s, perhaps in the 80s or the 90s. But stories of migration that continue, just like we looked into in public education prong. Now we have stories of migration from, you know, the late 70s and forward. It never stops, of course. And, you know, the concept of home and what is home everywhere. When you come from so many different intersections, is a concept that from a very young age, I think for a lot of immigrants also, we wonder, you know, where is home? And we really intentionally call this series Voices from Home because we want to say that when you come from different intersections, home can be Iran at the same time that it can be the United States, at the same time that it can be France, at the same time that it can be Nigeria, all this in one person, and one doesn't dilute the other. They're all as valid and actually complement and uplift one another. So with the Voices from Home, what we do at the collective is leverage with the different forms of multimedia, and we really look at different forms of multimedia. I mean, we have audios. It's pretty old school. Like, I mean, at least for, I think it's old school, but you know, having this recordings, but it's also a very dignified way to share a story where we share voice, we can hear, you know, the emotion, the vulnerability, the story, all these different vulnerability and sense of humanity that reminds us one another of our humanity despite our differences. And also with videos, with short films that we produce, that we make, as well as poetry. We've had also Afro-Iranians from Boucher write poetry about what it means to be Black to them. Because again, it's also nuances. We give a lot of room to nuances. This is your story. If you're from Bandar Bushehr, if you're from Paris, if you're from Zanzibar, if you're from Canada, it's your story, it's your voice. And what the collective does is like, this is the space, and we try to support the best we can so that the voices are amplified, as well as creatively disrupting existing conversations to make sure that the dialogue that we have is leading us toward an inclusive understanding of what it means to be who we are. And what do we mean by inclusive understanding? It means that one identity doesn't nullify the other. Because you're Black and Iranian doesn't mean that you're less one or less the other or more one than the other. It's actually two identities that come and fortify who we are, if anything. So we center Black Iranian narratives, and we have this motto of for us, from us, by us, with everyone, because it's important to center voices that we have never heard from. So we're often approached by folks who tell us, I didn't know there were Black Iranians, I'm a filmmaker, I'd love to make a film. And it's something like, well, how are you going to be better equipped at making a film if you've never heard about it than someone who was born and raised and breathed it and everything? How is this, are you self-centering, or are you truly helping for the conversation to move forward? And we're also lucky because folks are open to have difficult conversations like that, especially artists, where it's like, well, then what's the best way for me to amplify? And then the conversations becomes more nuanced. Like, okay, let's find ways to work together. And this first short film that was directed by Sara Farajzadeh, who's in Bandar Bushehr, who is Afro-Iranian, born and raised in Iran, is a product of this kind of dialogue and conversation. If technology permits, here is Siyazi Boss by Sara.
این حرفا چیه؟
واقعا حالا ببین اگه کار کنه.
اوایل رنگ پوستمو زیاد دوست نداشتم، ولی خب الان بهترین چیزیه که دارمش. واقعا دوستش دارم.
فکر میکنم که خیلی خواستم و اینکه یه چیزیه که اقلیت دارنش و به این خاطر دوستش دارم.
یه روز داشتم از مدرسه می اومدم، با مامانم بودم، یه پسری از ته دلش بهم گفت سیا. بعد خیلی بد گفت. مامانم یه جوری نگام کرد انگار دلش برام سوخت، ولی چون اون سفید بود حس میکردم نمیفهمه من چه حسی دارم.
پسر بچه بهم گفت که برو همون، چون فکر میکرد که من کثیفم، در صورتی که اصلا این شکلی نبود و این قلب منو شکوند.
This piece was made by Sara Farajzadeh, who is Busheri Iranian, Afro-Iranian, and she directed this absolutely gorgeous piece with a team of, director of photography, sound, writing their stories, what is the story that we want to share, what it is that we want everyone to hear and know, and how can we support the best that we can so that we can find the way also to balance how to tell a story while taking into consideration also the risk and of the conversation that we're having. Just to show you now a few more voices and apologies that we have to go about it this way. Alex, I'll give it to you, but let me just do the share screen again.
Absolutely. So the next two voices are from here. Well, not here for me, here for you guys, some people here in America on this side of the pond. As we'll get to this first video. This is Michudad Bevani, African-American Iranian from Fresno, California.
I was born in Fresno, California, and I am African-American and Iranian. I was born with this self-awareness of the injustice that continuously persists through the global community. I think of that arid afternoon where I was present in that endless crowd until something hit me differently this time. This time, that moment outside of Fresno City Hall, all of the stories of police brutality had seemed all more real and in person, It was that black woman who had been shot in her bed, a black boy who had been shot in his front yard, and a black man who had died of asphyxiation and more. Standing in front of the crowd of over 3,000 determined chants, I looked ahead, thinking about what it would mean for my African American ancestors.
As we said before, this is Mitra Bani from Fresno, California, and this Voices from Home is a little more, resonates more with some of the individuals on this side of the diaspora. Being Black in Canada, America, and Western society, the things we witness on a day-to-day is, even though we are Iranian, is a reflection of the color of our skin. All these experiences of, and police brutality, obviously what transpired summer of 2020 with George Floyd, is an everyday reality for Black people, period. And as Black Iranians, we sit at that intersection. And like I said before, those experiences are dictated by the color of our skin. So while we are fighting this, not fighting this, but having this conversation about fitting in and our identity as Iranians, we're busy fighting for our lives as Black people. And that's what gives this this intersection much more social responsibility, as Black individuals. As we heard from Mitra here, he was born with a different self-awareness. A lot of the conversations that we're having right now, for us, we've been having them all our lives. We've been having the conversations about identity. We have the conversations about how to interact with police. And, this stuff is really tough to discuss, but it's our reality. And being Black, you don't need to go to school to understand what it's like to be Black. You just have to be Black. We have a PhD.
Or to do research.
So it puts us at that intersection of people that are more than qualified to be having these conversations and leading these conversations. And that's why our Voices from Home series is important, especially within the diaspora. Our next Voices from Home, another Jamaican Iranian based in California, Nader, and his Voices from Home is a little different from the first two that we've seen.
بفرمایید.
ارکستر که بازی کردم همه پرسیدن این داستانش چیه، مامانش کیه، باباش کیه، چرا وایلن بازی میکنه، چرا بسکت بازی نمیکنه، چرا فوتبال بازی نمیکنه.
So that was Young Nader. He's based out of California, and the piece was actually directed by Priscillia. And this is another conversation that is very important, especially in the Iranian community, about, you know, this pressure to be something that maybe as an individual you might not be really wanting to pursue. So that's why these voices are very important, and they stand at that intersection, whether we're talking about our interactions with the police or if we're talking about interactions with our own people, right? All these conversations and all these voices are very crucial to the conversation. And when we're sitting at this intersection, we speak on behalf of Black people, and we also speak on behalf of Iranian people. So, Young Nader from California.
Absolutely.
That
So
brings
well
us to, that's a smooth transition, but it brings us to our third pillar, which is advocacy. Advocacy, obviously, as we said, that intersection is very important. And what is it if we're not advocating for, you know, Black Iranians, whether it's human rights or, you know, social causes and things of that nature. On our advocacy prong, you know, we try to use the tools at our disposal, and we work in collaboration with artists to convey certain messages, especially when things are happening in real world and in real time. So this post reads Khasta Shalim, and this post was during the news of, you know, the Breonna Taylor situation. For us, as we said, as Black people, constantly seeing a lack of justice on our behalf when things, you know, when there's violations of our human rights, from where I'm at, south of the border, but it happens north of the border as well, and it happens in France and Germany and all over the world.
It's global.
And it's global, yeah. And this post, in collaboration with one of our resident artists, Sahar Qureshi, was to just express the sentiment that, you know, Khasta Shalim, we're tired. You know, it is exhausting being Black. Like
At times, yeah.
There's no other way to put it. I don't know if Priscilla, if you wanted to jump in.
No, actually, I think it was such a critical and important time when we published the Mo Khasteim publication. I hope my voice is coming, but it was quite a critical time, because it was a time last summer where the Iranian American community was really laboriously, because it's okay to be critical as long as it's constructive, showing support to Black Lives Movement in a way that was exclusionary of Black voices, because it was in solidarity to, or in solidarity with. And it was important for us to use the word ma, which means we in Farsi. We are tired, ma khastein, instead of saying what's happening to them. We need to show solidarity. What the Iranian American community and the Iranian diaspora needs to do is that it's not them, it's us, because Blackness is part of the Iranian identity. And when Black folks are being attacked, it could well be a Black Iranian person. It could well be an Afro-Iranian person. It could well be someone whose parent is Tanzanian, the other parent's Kenyan, the other parent's Iranian, however we want to call it. It could be someone from our community. So when we want to show solidarity, we also have to ask ourselves, but is this an issue that's relevant within my community, happening within my community? Because if you ask me, when I drive in California, I'm driving while Black. I'm a Khobiruni, I'm Hastam, Magana. I'm both Iranian and Black. So what is that solidarity? Like, this is, we are tired. We Iranians are tired of the violence against Black folks. We are tired and we want change. So this was really important to us because it was happening at a time when conversations that were happening in the Iranian American diaspora was they. What can we do to help them? Right? And you know, when you attack somebody's life, I believe that it's everybody's problem, truly. But to think that it's an external problem to the community is deeply, deeply, deeply problematic. And I think that shows the need to start having conversations about who we are and actually who composes our community. I mean, do we even know, or we just look at the reflection of ourselves? So that's where the advocacy comes, you know, but also we've also positive messages, right, Alex?
Absolutely. As like, this is our heritage, right?
Which is what this one says in Farsi.
Exactly.
This is our heritage. And normally it would click because that's what our wonderful resident artist did in collaboration with us, but I don't want to go through the video and have to do all this gymnastics. So we'll just admire it as this beautiful art piece, and which takes us into the Let's Talk About Blackness series.
Yeah. Let's Talk About Blackness series is, you know, leading conversations about Blackness, you know, about, you know, how Blackness can be transnational, like we did discuss with our book club, and why that we have to rewrite these narratives and bring Blackness back to the forefront. You know, oftentimes, and I think for a long time, the word Black was, the connotation of it was so negative. So nobody wanted to be that, oh yeah, well, I don't want to say that Black person, you know, when they're describing people. But for us as Black people, you know, it's positive. We love it. You know, we love to talk about it. We enjoy when people discuss it with us. And yeah, Priscilla.
So definitely, I mean, I felt like you had already said so much. It's great. I mean, it's conversations that we bring to the community. You know, it's talking about the big elephants in the room, the beautiful Black, brown elephants in the room, and say, well, let's talk about it. Like, what's the problem? It's okay. Blackness is transnational. We also make it a point to translate it in Farsi, not because we think you need to speak Farsi to be Iranian. Absolutely not. Again, identities are transnational. They're cross borders. We live in a global society. We belong to a human fabric that's way larger than the very limited understanding of who we are. So it's more so, let's talk about Blackness, also this opportunity to speak to Black Iranians and Afro-Iranians who only speak Farsi, to have that conversation also with Black and Afro-Iranians who only speak Farsi, and, you know, have conversations around the fact that Black is indeed beautiful. And what does it mean? So we talk also about the challenges that we face in the community and challenges of anti-Blackness, which are extremely present in our community. And I think we shouldn't shy away from constructively being critical about our community. We have so many wonderful Iranian American activists, scholars, or, you know, it doesn't matter, Baker, whoever, whatever, in the workforce or not. We have such a great understanding on so many different topics. But when it comes to talking about race in our community, it doesn't exist. This is the West. What are we saying? Do I not exist, or that doesn't exist? What is it that doesn't exist? Because I'm here, I'm Black, and I'm Iranian. So are you not saying that I'm Black, or are you saying that I'm not Iranian, or which is it? Of course, we know because we read and because we research and because we know who we are, and we're learning, and we're also okay with making mistakes and growing with an open heart. We know that there is also obviously a lot of ignorance around even the fact that the Persian Gulf slave trade was abolished in 1929. There was erasure of that part of history. We were raised, a lot of us, by parents who didn't know the history and told us about Dariush our entire childhood, and Sarius and the human rights, all that and all this, but they didn't tell us about that slavery also enslaved African Black folks. Rather, when we would have conversations like this, it would be, it wasn't that mean. But it's not the same as what happened in America, but it's not, which is also another way of silencing, of wanting to bring nuances that's not a nuance, because we want to have a conversation about the fact that we have always been here and we'll stay here, And therefore, we can no longer ignore the racial realities and dynamics that exist within the diaspora. And if we ignore them, the only thing we're doing is pushing the burden to our children and the children of our children. That's the only thing we're doing, because race isn't going to go anywhere in the Iranian diaspora. So might as well talk about it and learn how do we coexist with our beautiful differences. So we send messages like this, and the echo that we get from the Black Iranian and Afro-Iranian community is truly the one that we are truly interested in. How I've always felt that. This is exactly what I've always wanted to say. I didn't know it was possible for me to think like this in this environment. I thought this could only apply, you know, when I'm in my American groups, you know, sets of people. People think colonization only hit one side of the world and kind of gracefully forgot about the other side. It's like, wait a second, it did not. We actually share a lot in common in what we're trying to overcome, way more than we think. So the Let's Talk About Blackness series, that all this, we send messages based on our POV, our point of view. What does it mean that Blackness is transnational? Why is it so important to say it? Well, because folks always tell us, I didn't know there were Black people in Iran. Well, now we can tell them Blackness is transnational. There is no place where you should go thinking there aren't going to be any kind of folks. First of all, what kind of reasoning is it even to walk around in life thinking that in a particular location, you will not find a particular group of people? Interesting, to say the least. It means we can find it everywhere. And of course, diversity being beautiful, or at least for the collective and at the collective, we're not going to shy away from it. And we invite the community to come sit at these conversations, even if it's the first time that you're hearing from them, only because, again, if we don't want to take care of it, somebody else will. And it better be that we do now on and move forward. Continues with the consciousness series, if you want to, so I can drink some water.
Yeah, so with the consciousness series, you know, we center Black thinkers, you know, Pan-Africanism and you know, trying to, right, once again, it's shifting that narrative of what it means to be conscious and be a thinker. And we put Black thinkers, authors, writers at the forefront of our learning and like thought leadership. You know, there's so many brilliant African thinkers that society could learn a lot from. And here at the collective, we prioritize like public education. And that's not for the people outside the collective, it's also for us in the collective. So a lot of it is a lot of reading on our part and understanding and trying to open our eyes and our minds to, you know, what it truly means to be an intellectual and having the intellectual courage to disrupt the status quo and disrupt narratives around Blackness in Africa.
Yeah, absolutely. And also making sure that in the diaspora, we no longer continue with that single narrative of understanding of who we are, but rather give space to all the different iterations of what it means to be Iranian. We find a lot of power in going back to Black African thinkers from across the diaspora. We have an understanding of being Black African in a very large sense of it, because, you know, again, Blackness being transnational, this identity is found everywhere. We want to go back to see what did this translate in their understanding of our ancestors, of contemporary folks as well, so that we can shift the conversation from an Africa that's often perceived for many to this day as this single land that's a block of one monolith culture with, for those who really have no clue, maybe you have elephants greeting you, potentially a tiger coming to pick you up at the airport. We want to say that Africa is not just safaris and savannah. Africa is wisdom, it's poetry, it's literature, it's knowledge, it's thought leadership. And Iranian diaspora is also Black African. And that's how we dive then into the CLZ boss and the Black is Beautiful, which is also part of our advocacy prong. We call it advocacy because we do live in a diaspora that is predominantly pushing for beauty standards. And we're talking here about the Iranian diaspora. Let us be very, very clear that the beauty standards that are being pushed in our community are beauty standards that are obsessed with white-centric, mainstream criteria. And we're here to say that it doesn't have to be that way. And of course, Black is also beautiful. All these different ways of looking are beautiful. We don't have to try to adhere to this white standard of wanting to look like a European. It's okay to look the way you are, and Black is also beautiful. So again, also the feedback from this series, you know, which is something that we knew, but also for all of us individually, collectively, was a journey into understanding that Black is beautiful. Because again, when you are from the margins, and we know that a lot of Iranian American fellows or Iranian Canadians or from all around the world who are immigrants in the country that they come from already feel like they're part of the margin. I would like to say to them, add being Black. You can be an immigrant, you can be Iranian and be Black at the same time. Just think about that experience and how important it is therefore to say Siyazi boss, because of how invisible it has been for the mainstream of the diaspora. And so we do so by recreating these really Iranian moments, either from our imagination or from our childhood or from other people's Black Iranians, Afro-Iranians' childhood, but we ground them in authenticity to make sure that it can also speak to others. And so in this beautiful illustration and art piece done by Sahar Horishi, who is one of our wonderful resident artists, you can see, you know, a mother doing her daughter's hair. And this piece, Muhaye Zibat, your beautiful hair, is such an important piece for girls who don't feel like they can be seen or not being represented in a community. If you pick up any Iranian book right now in Los Angeles, you don't have any representation of a Black Iranian child. So for parents who have Black children, what are they going to do? Go to the Black section because Blackness is foreign from the Iranian community, but your child is Iranian and Black. We are a part of the community. So, you know, very tirelessly, what we do is to make sense of these realities and also invite everyone to say, it's going to be okay. We knew that it was that diverse. Let's just talk about it now. And I guess that leads us, I think, right, Alex, to the end of our presentation on Siyazi Boss and the collective. But stay tuned with us. You can find us also in the different media outlets. We're working as hard as we can on top of our daily obligations and jobs and personal lives. I'd like to really emphasize we're not a political organization. We are not a religious organization. We don't have any agenda. We are just Black Iranian folks who want to make this community less anti-Black. And we need your support with it.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful and so interesting. And I'm so impressed at how much you've done in, you know, such a short amount of time. And I just have a couple questions that I wanted to maybe use as a springboard for talking a little bit. I'm intrigued by the one pillar of your work, the advocacy piece. Do you see that advocacy piece translating into some concrete action that we might do, those of us in the Iranian diaspora, other than, like, I think the amplify thing is like easy, but the harder thing is doing very real allyship or stepping up and confronting racism and anti-Blackness directly. So I'm wondering, is that something that is on us, or do you have some tools for us to maybe think about utilizing? I hope I was clear. Because I think there is this, you know, this need to do some conversation, but I think it's painful. And I think sometimes there's such a schism between what you're identifying as this erasure and then getting to the point where you can actually advocate for some very real, meaningful push towards, I I don't know, a greater visibility?
Starts with
Alex?
dialogue. Yeah, it starts with dialogue. You know, when we talk about it, then we can actually come to the table and problem solve and find out how to make that push. I'm not sure if you guys in Canada, after the George Floyd incidents of the summer, a lot of the municipalities had opened up conversations. You know, they had the public come and say their piece on how they think we can make real change and move things forward. And in this situation, it's the same thing. You know, in order to make those pushes, we need to start with the first action, which is having the conversations. And it shouldn't just be us as Black Iranians having the conversations. It should be Iranians taking it upon themselves to have those conversations. And when you start to have the conversations, then you can talk about, okay, some of the things that might have question marks. I know some people are curious about Haji Firuz and how we feel about that. And that is a conversation that, you know, we do have over here at the collective. So everything starts with dialogue. And when the idea is put out there and then the conversation begins, then you can start to work towards solutions. So for us here at the collective, we're here to spark that conversation. And then when everyone is starting to participate in the conversation, everybody's starting to have the dialogue, not only with us, but with each other, then we can start rolling out, you know, other steps to make that push an even bigger push.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
No, I think to add to Alex's points, you know, I think a lot of what the collective is doing, I think, is being taken offline by already a lot of Iranians across the diaspora. Because when we do share reading material, or when we work on a history piece, for instance, and we do the Khyzran history piece over the period of 10 weeks, where we go through the histories of Khyzran and how she was born in Zanzibar and what happened to her and so forth. We put the sources, and we've had you know, feedback from folks who go into the sources, who joins the book club, and then who have conversations in their families about what they've read. And they come back to us and said, wow, I was for the first time able to tell my mom that slavery was actually abolished in 29 and, you know, 1929. And she didn't know. And so we started having that conversation. And I found out through the collective, not through their studies, I don't know where, but through the collective, because I think the impact of the collective is already felt offline and is already concretely being taken actually with steps that we may not see right now the actual material impact, but we see it already in the way people are conversing with us, and how now the conversation hopefully can then move to the next step of not knowing to, as you know, as Alex said, let's have that conversation.
Mm-hmm. But we can't talk about what we don't know.
Exactly.
And I think right now in this day and age, despite all the access to information, there's a lot of access to misinformation, and that misinformation contributes to more regressive conversations. So I think first, but even before the conversation, is we need to be armed with that education prong. That's why all the pillars tie into each other, right? That's why the public education prong is important. That's why the amplification is important, and that's what makes advocacy move as well. So.
Yeah. Well, the other thing that I'm so interested in is that the idea that it's education in a non-institutional context, you know, like that you're presenting material that normally, you know, happens in the context of a four-wall classroom or a university that sort of puts its rubber stamp on it. And so I love that idea of also disrupting the delivery of educational resources is powerful. And it's also kind of important in a moment like this, when we sort of understand that even the way that we conduct ourselves through institutions has been altered irreparably by something like the pandemic. And the idea that you're using these social media platforms to do it is also very powerful. So I think it's I hope you don't put me out of business, but, but I think it's really important. And I'm sort of inspired by that because I see in some ways it has a different kind of impact. You know, it's a very empowering way to bring education to people, and it kind of creates less hierarchy, I guess, if you will.
No, absolutely, Persis, and thank you for, pointing that out. We actually, at the very early stages of the collective, I spent a lot of time making sure that the history content would be democratized, would be made available to the masses. When I started my own journey of better understanding the different parts of who I am and what does it mean, what does it come from, and what's the history, the factual history, not opinions from people around me who haven't necessarily been through these experiences. I very quickly realized that first, there was very little available when it comes to public education, and when it comes actually to this very topic, there was very little. It's so scarce. And what's available now so often is deeply problematic because it doesn't look into none of the work from a Black studies lens or perspective. So it looks at it and saying, yes, we had slavery in the first line, and then everything else is how we had domestic servants and how we had, concubines. So I thought we had slavery. Like, how did we? And you have books written in this language, not many, because again, it goes back to my first point. These are, to me, it's very dangerous and harmful content. I think there is responsibility that comes with research. There is responsibility that comes with everything we do. And we're actually doing research on folks who exist. This is not like, we don't belong to museums, these are folks like we exist. Alex is not in the section of the Met. I don't belong to like the Louvre or anything. We're regular people like anybody else. And perhaps it's stories that we haven't really heard, but we have, because we live with ourselves and with one another. So at some point, it's also important to know what we do. Why do we do what we do? Do we want to actually empower people in knowing who they are? Or do we just want people to know about my research? It's like everything else, I think. And with the collective, we don't want people to know, we're not here to become like fast, furious, and famous. Honestly, it's such a labor of pain, this work and love. It's so difficult to go back in these stories, to listen to the stories that trigger you to other stories, to read the comments and the reactions and the erasure. And it's extremely painful process. And we do so only because we love our community. Otherwise, we'll just ignore it.
Yeah. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the chapters, and if you've, I know you have this sort of collective vision, but there must be also their own nuances and differences for a person who's living in Germany and is contending with a different political praxis around race than somebody in the US or France. And is that part of the conversation as well, in terms of thinking a little bit about what these different locations bring to this conversation, either historically or in the present moment?
I think context is very important to this conversation, and every country's context is different when it comes to the conversation of race, of intersection. I think, when we talk about Canada and America, it's a little more similar in terms of the histories behind the countries and how race is, how anti-Blackness might be perpetuated in society. There's a lot more parallels there, but when you go across the pond and you start to talk about France and Germany, the anti-Blackness there, even though it's the same phenomena, it's very different. It's just delivered much differently. It's much more explicit in France. Obviously we know Germany's history with race and stuff like that. So of the co-founders, we for ourselves that are in these different countries, we take it upon ourselves to take a different approach depending on where we are at that moment. Everything won't look like how it looks like in America, and that's fine. But it will differentiate based on where we are. And it launch started with America and then Canada. And then as we, it's only been 6 months now, as we progress and as we improve and, day by day get better and learn more, we can start to replicate the same formula, but with the different nuances depending on which country we're in. So.
I want to make sure that I give space for the people who are asking questions. So I'm going to start with the most recent one. Asks, while on the topic of the BLM movement, I wonder if I can ask you how you feel about blackface or of Haji Firuz, especially getting closer to Nowruz. This topic has been coming up in our communities, and I see big conflicts amongst Iranians about it. I think this should be a conversation where we hear from our Black and Afro-Iranian friends and how they feel about it. And if you have any information on its history beyond what is available online, I'd be glad to hear it.
Well, with the work of our resident historian, Bita Bakhulizadeh, she actually just released an article regarding Haji Firuz and the origins and a lot of the misconceptions and the myths surrounding the practice, obviously with Nowruz coming around. I think we can come to the consensus that blackface is just not okay, period. Period, no matter where you're doing it, what you're doing it for. And, this may gaslight some Iranians, but a lot of the justifications for Haji Firuz is, oh, well, it's a part of tradition. Oh, well, he's a character in the Shahnameh. Oh, well, it's from Zoroastrian roots. And when we're having these conversations, you can't come with, misconceptions, myths, opinions, whatever my Khaleh said. That doesn't work when you're having progressive conversations about race and anti-Blackness. The facts say that Haji Firuz was derived from, the Khyzran dynasty and was a slave. It's in the lyrics that he sings in the songs when you're translating them. And the blackface of, we leave it to Bita Bakhulizadeh to debunk, the myths surrounding it. But, if you're asking me as a Black man, it's not okay, and not just because if we make the exception because we're Iranian for Haji Firuz, then we got to make it for America. We got to make it for everywhere, right?
I mean, also we have to. I think it's to. Let me just say one thing: you don't need to go in history and dig deep, but you're welcome to do so. We just shared some of the sources that we believe to be reliable in the chat. But I think what's also very important is to recognize each other's humanity. And history has nothing to do with this. This is just humans living alongside to one another. Me personally, as a human being, I wouldn't be involved as much as I can in any celebration or performances or, that may be deeply offensive and harmful to an entire group of people around the world. So I think at some point we also have to be, we have to be more critical. We have to do better. These questions are not going to make us move forward. It is racist. Yes, it is, because it makes us feel uncomfortable. When I saw Haji Firuz growing up, I felt extremely insulted. I was the only Black little girl. Is that helpful for people to know that it's racist? I mean, there's so many stories of how harmful the sight of blackface Haji Firuz is for Black folks. Mm-hmm. I mean, and how much more history and articles, how much more attention do we need to give to the scholarly side of it? And when are we going to start paying attention to how it makes Black folks feel? And actually think that that alone is valid, not to be engaging in it.
Mm-hmm. And I think it also requires a lot of relearning. We learned one thing, but is it right for us to stick with this one thing if it's wrong? I especially right now where we're at in society, there's a lot of relearning that needs to happen, because we may have been fed, harmful information, wrong information. So, and that takes individual responsibility. It's not on the collective to move that conversation forward. That's something as an individual you have to look at and be like, that's wrong.
I mean, would you dress as Haji Firuz is also a question you can ask yourself. Like, if you feel that it's not racist, please go ahead and celebrate it in Westwood with the blackface. And, I think if no Black folks are felt, it's harmful. And to me, that's where I draw the line. It's harm. Even if it's not harm that's necessarily felt by the dominant group, it's still harm.
A lot of people are expressing their gratitude and their appreciation for what you're doing and your openness. And I want to make sure that they know how to support your work. So if you want to say a little bit more about that, we have some of the links that Priscilla provided for the projects that you learned about. So please look at the chat. But if there's certain things you want us to lend support to specifically, please feel free, Priscilla and Alex, to tell us as an audience. And there is one question. Is there a Farsi translation for Afro-Iranian? Would love to learn how to be more mindful with my Persian Farsi.
Check our website and all our posts. It's translated all over. Check us out on the website, on our social media, Collective for Black Iranians, Amplifying Black and Afro Voices. You'll see Afro-Irani, Ironicia, you'll see it written all over. We're also language being alive. As I think Alex said it earlier also, like we give room for people also to say, well, yes, I'm of African descent, but I'm of Black African descent. And that Black is very central to my experiences. So we also give room to that. So I think hopefully the information that we put on our different social media and website is helpful, but I also think observing with respect and dignity is also a way to know what's the best way, to address to someone. I think just asking yourself that question is already such a great indicator.
Yeah.
Is asking, what are your top 3 requests that you have of the Iranian community in terms of how they can advocate for Afro-Iranians?
Top 3 priority, or what was it?
Top 3
requests.
Requests. Only 3?
We'll start with those.
Well, at least can we okay, we start with those. Alex, go ahead.
Like for me, the first thing I would say is seek information. Seek like real information. I think a lot of times we go off hearsay, and it's like we said before, it's very dangerous. It's a very dangerous. It's dangerous because it sometimes it involves a broken telephone and misinformation. So I think the accountability and the intellectual courage we instill in ourselves by seeking our own information and learning to think critically about it, and finding out if it's valid is the first thing, because when you have the information, everything else becomes easier to understand, but you can't understand what you don't know. So
yeah, and to add to this, when I look for guidance, I think I like to look into ancestors and folks who were here before me, because I'm like, there's nothing that I'm going through that they haven't been gone through. And I think truly, ancestors in the large sense of it, again, I don't think about it in terms of border, but if you think, for instance, of one of the big requests for the Iranian communities, for me at least personally, is to be constructively critical of who we are and give room for constructive criticism. We do have a lot of fragility going on in the community when it's about questions of race, and it takes up a lot of space, and it doesn't enable us to have questions that enable us to move forward. The collective is not here to answer necessarily questions. And again, all questions are great, but we want questions that enable us to imagine a society where we're more knowledgeable of one another. And to us, should we wear blackface or not, is not a question that can push us to a society that brings us forward, because it makes a marginalized segment of that community, unfortunately, feel insulted. So what I think for one of the top asks would be to always, if you love your community, you know, in kind of a paraphrasing the wonderful, powerful words of James Baldwin, but if you love the country you're from, if you love the community you're from, then you should reserve the right to be critical of that place constructively with love. And if you truly love being a part of the Iranian community, then you should make sure that this community is actually in line with what you believe in. And if, you know, anti-Blackness is not something that you believe in, then be actively standing by it. I don't think you need a manual to be a kind person. I think oftentimes these things are very organic to us. It's just, do you trust that intuition? You know, if you're asking yourself, is Huddersfield racist? Probably is, you know?
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think you're absolutely right that the kinds of questions and conversations need to move beyond that, because in some ways that's a foil, right? It gets us stuck in that narrative, and it's a one that elicits a lot of defensiveness that prevents people from
forward.
Yeah. I also wanted to ask you a question, and maybe I want to make sure there's no more. Somebody asked how we can support you, so please make sure that you go to their website. I'm sure you have a donate button, right? Okay.
We do. We're not so good at promoting it, but Percy, since it's the second time you've asked, yes, we do have a donate button, and thank you for insisting.
Yes.
Thank you, Persis. We do have a donate button. We appreciate, you know, we operate, everything is pro bono. We all do this, but again, we think it's so necessary. The community is only, hopefully, it's already so diverse, and hopefully will even be more diverse. So we truly believe that these conversations need to be held in ways that make sense, in ways that center Blackness. Otherwise, we're not having conversations. It's just performative chit chat again. But, you know, you can donate, but also I think a great way to help when we have issues of not being seen, or, you know, we talked about erasure, we talked about historical erasure. Why do we talk about historical erasure? Just ask your parents and grandparents. They've never heard about slavery being abolished in 1929. That's erasure right there. When you're in an environment and a context where you have historical erasure, and then contemporaneously in today's society, it's just being ignored, whether it's conscious or subconscious, you know, it's a whole range of a level. What's very important to show support is to amplify, share our work. I know sometimes it doesn't look great in your timeline, guys, but not sharing the work is not going to help us make the room bigger. We don't push ignorance with silence. We do not. And we're taking the forefront right now, potentially for the children of your children that aren't even here. So if you could at least amplify our voices, if you don't have a penny, it's totally fine. The click of sharing, so that we don't have to hear, I didn't know there were Black folks in Iran. You're already doing a lot, because we're fighting erasure here. So if you're not sharing, you're not helping.
Thank you. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the whole issue of trauma in the Iranian community, and how there's this, there's a lot of trauma because of the events that have happened in the last 40 years. And then there's the added traumas that you have spoken about microaggressions or major aggressions that occur in the lives of Black Iranians. And I wonder if that's a conversation that we also need to have in some ways, is to think a little more critically about the way the response to traumatic political or historical or familial or personal events in some ways prevents some of these other conversations that are part of these intersections of events and lives. And if that's something that you've thought about, or it's something that you hope to engage with, because for me, it's also this idea that I see a lot of traumatic responses to critical questions that are raised, you know, and I feel it on some very deep level that it's unresolved or ununderstood trauma that has sort of made people defensive in the eyes of whatever's happening in their immediate environment?
Yes, so we do have, through the collective, we're working towards pushing contents that would look into healing, into the healing aspect of it. But something that's very important maybe to also state about the collective is that, we founded it also for Black and Afro-Iranians. So when it comes to, trauma or experiences of trauma, whether it stems from childhood or professional experiences as an adult, or, that's also compiled with, if you're an immigrant, right, from an Iranian family, also with all these other traumas as well that can stem from it as well. So to us is also, while we continue to center Blackness, how do we heal together, is something that the collective will be launching soon, hopefully, with the means that we have, the determination and the passion, and also, the critical thinking that we don't, Haji Firuz and the conversations around Haji Firuz will not stop us. Clearly, we're here, to move beyond that. We're really looking forward, actually, to celebrating Nowruz without blackface, Haji Firuz, like every other Nowruz. I'm looking forward to, read some Hafiz and African proverbs to my kids and not have to explain to them why this man is dressed with his blackface and singing master, slave, and this and that. Why? It's just not bringing anything valuable intellectually in my life. So I think, the healing conversations are so important, but again, to us, it's important to center Blackness in it, because again, it's been erased, it's been ignored. And so how do we heal then from conversations that didn't even happen? And when they did, it was through, ignorance, and ignorance can be extremely violent, very harmful it's harmful as a statement, but then it can be also turned into some different expression of violence. That ignorance can go actually really, really, really far based on where you are, who you are, what's your degree of vulnerability, what's the level of, violence that you're being served with. And what we want to do for once, I think in this community, it's so central that we actually think about those on the receiving end of that violence. And what can we do now so that we can still, live with a better understanding of one another, despite these realities that actually, exist among any. As soon as you have a community, it's global.
Thank you. And I'm really, I'm glad you brought up the idea of centering Blackness, because I do think that it's something I've learned from the process of talking to you and other members in your collective, is this idea that it's not a displacement, right? It's a gathering, right? And that sort of a gathering of narratives, it feels very important to make everyone feel like they belong. And one of the comments was from a person who's half Iranian, who stated that she never felt like she was enough. And you spoke to that, Priscilla, at the beginning. And I think that's a really important thing, that there is no sort of authentic, and that in some ways we're making a kind of Iranianness anew, and we're gathering all the pieces that were maybe forgotten, erased, lost, omitted, to rejuvenate that. So I really appreciate what you're saying about the centering piece, because it's also a foundation as opposed to a hierarchy that moves
exactly up. Exactly. It's truly just gathering around voices that A, we may not know have existed, so why not gather? And B, that we may not have ever heard. So again, why not gather? So it's exactly everything you said. And for the comments of this individual, I just would like to say, if I can, you're not half Iranian. You are Iranian, and whatever else you are, 100. You're 200. And if there is a third part of your identity, that makes you 300. It's not this understanding of who we are with this scientific concept of trying to measure it. I don't know when it started historically, but even in our Farsi language, we find it when we say dorage, that connotation is being from several places doesn't dilute one of the places where you're from. It amplifies it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right. Well, I want to just one more time shout out to the collective for their amazing work, and you can find those links in the chat. So please follow them, amplify, share as Priscilla requested. I think just the visibility, it's interesting because it pops up sometimes in my feed, and it's really interesting how like it changes my perception just to see some of these images. So I do think like your comment, Alex, about representation is so profoundly important to sort of switching the, you know, the synapses in our brain to think about the idea that these characters, these visibilities exist, and they're not so abnormal or unusual. So I love all the work you're doing with the arts as well. So let us know how we can continue to support you and share the work you're doing. And I also think that there's a role for those of us who are not Black Iranians to do more advocacy. And I look forward to hearing a little bit more about how we can, you know, be true allies and also think a little bit about the longer term, as you said, about thinking about it in terms of what it means for our children and grandchildren. So, okay, well, I think we're kind of at the end of our time here. So thank you so much. Really a privilege to have the both of you. And I thank also the other members of your founding collective and all the other people who are working hard to support you in their pro bono work, because I think that's really, it's amazing how professional it is when you have so many other jobs going on in your lives. So kudos to you.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's because we want it. It's because it's so necessary. It's because these are spaces that we needed as children, you know. Some of us are still young, but we're no longer kids. And it's spaces that I needed when I was in Tehran. It's a space that I needed when I was in Paris. It's a space that I needed everywhere I was in the diaspora, to know that there is an echo to who I am.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And Samira, I don't know if you're still with us, but Samira Safa runs a podcast called We're Not So Different. She said she'd like to invite you to
the title.
Our podcast. So I'm going to make sure she gets in touch with you. And there's a lot of people who are now, I think we're seeing it much more, who are marriages between either Africans and African Americans and Iranians. So there's a whole generation of children growing up in this country who probably are so grateful for this work at this moment, for them to talk to their children about some of this stuff, and their parents, of course, right? So I also think that intergenerational conversation is so, so important. So thank you again. And with that, I thank you, and I wish you the best, and I'll be joining your book group soon. So I look forward to reading with you.
Yay.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Persis. And thanks to everybody at the center, the audience for listening. Pepa, Parisa, Ruha, Ryan, Shino. Wow, it's a lot of unis. Hi, guys. Thank you so much.
Okay. Good night. Thank you.
Take care.
Bye-bye.